Doğmap ölgen ko'chalarda Ümit üzme aziz xalqim Ümit üzme ey ana yurt Biz atlandık bu küreşke O yıl taştak uyuşup Allah verse bu nusretni Bizgilerimiz sep bulup Zalimlarni yığlatgudek Uğuz gibi küçlük bulup Lepildeydu asminanda Göz çaknitip şu günü Ay yıldızlık gök bayrağım Ey ana makan Ay yıldızlık gök bayrağım.
Around the world, many minorities are disadvantaged under the laws of their own countries purely because of their religion or ethnicity. This puts them at greater risk of human trafficking. For example, last year, Arise helped to expose the phenomenon of faith-targeted human trafficking, where Christian girls from Pakistan were being sold as brides, trafficked, and forced to marry men thousands of miles away. We also worked with Yazidi victims of Daesh, who suffered unspeakably. Both these groups were at risk because of their faith.
Can I ask you why people are kneeling, blindfolded and shaven and being led to trains in modern China?
In recent months, credible accusations of forced labour have surfaced regarding Turkic Muslims and other ethno-religious minorities in Western China, affecting many of the brands we consume daily. Many of those suffering at the front line cannot raise their voices for fear of reprisals, and so Arise is working to amplify the voices of these people. Through our trustee parliamentarians, we've been pushing for a human rights threshold to apply to businesses to ensure that those companies connected to suspected slavery in the Uyghur region of China are held to account. But we need to go much further. This isn't just a question for governments. Consumers are the sleeping giant against human trafficking and modern slavery. Only by building this movement and voting with our feet will we succeed in bringing exploitation to an end. Thank you for standing with us.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers and sisters. As you saw before, we have a very special guest for you today. You saw the ad. Today we have Mr. Luke de Pulford. I'll just give you a little bit of information about him. Luke was educated between the UK, Italy, and Lesotho. Luke came to an early appreciation of the importance of solidarity. Much of his professional life has focused on the UK Parliament, where he is well known for his work in defense of human dignity. Luke is co-founder and director of the Arise Foundation, which combats human trafficking and modern slavery. He also co-founded the Coalition for Genocide Response and advises the World Uyghur Congress. Alongside this, Luke is a fellow of Hong Kong Watch and a commissioner of the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission. He was also the driving force behind the creation of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China and coordinates it. So without further ado, I'd like everyone to welcome to Talkies Turkestan, Mr. Luke de Pulford. How are you today, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, I'm great. Good to be here.
I wanted to get you onto the show because your organizations and the organizations that you're involved with, especially Arise Foundation, the World Uyghur Congress, and especially IPAC, is advocating for supporting, trying to get the people's support, government support, trying to change up policy to put pressure on China to let up on its oppression of not just the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibetans, and others. So For people that don't know what Arise Foundation is, we're going to get into IPAC because that's what I want to focus on. But Arise Foundation, an organization that you've founded, could you please tell us a little bit about this?
Sure. Well, look, it's good to be here, and thanks for the invitation. Arise focuses really on building up grassroots work against modern slavery and human trafficking. So it does that mainly in South Asia and in the Philippines, in Eastern Europe, but source countries where people are trafficked from. So what we do is we work with and through civil society to try to build up networks to confront what is a truly evil crime affecting, we think, as many as 40 million people at any one moment. So that's what I do. That's the principal focus of what Arise is about. But as you mentioned, I'm involved in a lot of other work. The work on slavery is what has brought, I think, me personally and Arise into contact with obviously what is happening in Western China around the Uyghurs, and particularly around forced labor, because apart from North Korea, where we don't have much visibility and we don't really know what's going on, the largest example of state-sponsored slavery anywhere in the world is occurring there. And the main constituency, which is the victim of that, are the Uyghur people. So that's the connection between my day job, if you like, and what we're doing on, particularly related to the abuse of Uyghurs, the mass abuse of Uyghurs. But with a lot of these other hats, there's a connection to it as well.
For our audience, thank you for the introduction on your foundation, but I want to specifically focus on IPAC today, the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, and you coordinate or you play a part in this. First of all, for the audience who don't know what IPAC is, what is it and why is it important?
So IPAC is an international, very much bipartisan or cross-party group of legislators which has come together to try to defend the values of the rules-based and human rights orders against what they see as a threat from the People's Republic of China. Now, the important thing to say about IPAC is that they are not governments, they are legislators. They are what we would call in the UK backbench legislators. They don't have government jobs. Nevertheless, they are people who will be taken very seriously in their own political parties. We have a group of co-chairs. What we call the co-chairs are one person from either of the two big political parties in their own jurisdiction. Now, the reason I'm not saying country is that we also have the EU, which isn't a country. So we're talking about legislatures, so lawmaking bodies. And we've got two co-chairs from each of those for what now is 19 legislatures. So it's very international, and the group has grown and grown. And with those co-chairs, we have a group of members who are also legislators who want to join and support the effort. So it's a large group now. It's about 200 legislators, 19 legislatures, so 19 areas, and a group of, I think, about 38 co-chairs who are really determining the direction and deciding what the agenda should be. So this is a group of people that came together really because it believed the rules-based and human rights orders to be under very serious threat, and that there needed to be international unity in order to stand up to it, and it had to be international. Like, generally speaking, look, there is I think a feeling that where countries have tried to stand up to the People's Republic of China's agenda, they've done so alone. They've been picked off. They have found themselves victimized. They found themselves undermined, threatened through diplomacy or lawfare, and haven't been able to take the stand that they wanted to, and have not found adequate defense from the people who would normally stand with them, with whose values they would agree. So I think this is a fairly clearly accepted problem now. Like, people understand that if the rules-based order, which is something that belongs to the international community, not just one country, if it's going to be defended, it has to be defended internationally by a group of countries. So, I don't want to market IPAC as the solution to all of these things. IPAC is a way of enabling there to be coordination in defense of the rules-based order, because the issue of China has become so overwhelming. Okay, so that's one thing. But the associated thing with that is that it is not enough. IPAC is not enough. There have to be corresponding groups of governments that are coming together and doing exactly the same thing and saying, okay, we're in a position now where our international institutions, our understanding of human rights, our understanding of international rules are being undermined to an extent that our governments must come together to reassert those values and to defend them. So that's the essence behind IPAC, but we do it in the context of legislators. So people who are non-governmental but who are elected, and that's the essence of what it's all about.
With what you said, they're not necessarily part of the government. They're sort of shadow ministers, aren't they? I guess the idea is, if these people eventually get voted into government, do you think they'd end up leaving IPAC and sort of change their ways? Because it's sort of easy to criticize your own government when you're not in power, not doing enough against China. So I'll play devil's advocate there.
So no, I wouldn't agree with that. First of all, I think that politicians who get into cabinet positions or ministerial positions, I think they rarely change their minds. They find themselves in a situation where they can't speak as freely. And that's one of the reasons, IPAC has that as a real advantage. We have politicians who can say what they think. And that's great, because it means that they can speak freely about the problems that China is presenting to us. But when they get into government, I think we have to assume that they take those opinions with them. In my experience, for the most part, that's the case. There is nothing per se that should prevent somebody being both a minister and a member of IPAC. It's just a matter of convention in a lot of countries that you wouldn't do that. So in the UK, it would be seen as very strange for somebody to be within the government and then also to be externally a part of campaigning groups. It's like we've got a bit of a constitutional convention against it. But in other countries, it's not the case. And we don't have a firm policy on it. We'd happily have ministers. But generally speaking, I think it helps for people to be able to speak freely and without the constraint of a cabinet position. It gets much more complicated when you're having to take into account a whole kind of party line, if you see what I mean. And we don't have that issue right now.
What's interesting is I've looked at the introduction of the website. There's like an intro page, and it says, they're made up of mainly, legislators working towards reform on how democratic countries approach China. Now, what I found interesting was that most of these democratic, or all of the democratic countries, the legislators are from Western countries. Besides one, you've got Japan, but democratic countries within, say, Middle East. So, for example, I'm thinking of like a Turkey, or I'm thinking Indonesia or Malaysia. We don't see Muslim, quote unquote, Muslim leaders step up and join IPAC. Is there a reason for this? Have you shunned them, or are they just, they're wanting to stay away? Have they been invited, or what's going on here? Do you know?
Yeah, okay, so the first thing to say is that Uganda as well are represented, and I wouldn't describe them as a Western country, but generally speaking, yes, there is a skew towards Western countries right now. Now, the reason for that is that when we started building it, we wanted it to be predominantly focused on Five Eyes. It was going to be sort of a Five Eyes thing and grow from there. Now, the way that it worked for one reason or another is that actually it ended up going broader than Five Eyes quite early on. And we wanted it to not just have the Western flavor, because part of the narrative we think of the Chinese Communist Party around all of this stuff is that, the rules-based order is a sort of Western conception imposed upon everywhere else. And that is absolutely not the case. And for that reason, we need not only to have quote-unquote Islamic nations represented, where they're democratic, but we also need to have countries from all over the world, and they couldn't be associated with a sort of Western sense of imperialism, because we recognize that as a vulnerability, and we recognize that as a narrative of the Chinese Communist Party, which must be debunked. So for all those reasons, very much open to the possibility of Middle Eastern countries joining where they're democratic, where we can get co-chairs from each of the main political parties, where they're happy to work cross-party, and where the people involved actually have clout within their own political parties. Because if they don't, we're not going to be able to do what we want to do. It's no use us having mavericks as co-chairs in IPAC. We want to try to change the the way that political parties are thinking and then what governments do. That's not going to be possible if the only people who are joining us are like the out and out China hawks, if you see what I mean. So subject to all those caveats, yes, very much, of course. We need to have Middle Eastern nations represented. The issue around that is that, without revealing too much, IPAC can't get too big right now, because if it does, it will become unmanageable. It's going to need some pretty serious handling if it gets bigger. We don't want to create UN 2.0. It's not what this is about. It needs to be a lean institution which is capable of acting quickly and coordinating quickly. The more countries that are involved, the harder that gets. Also, we don't currently have the world's biggest democracy represented at all, which is India. So we want to get over that line, and we want to get over some of the other lines in the Middle East, and in time it will happen. So there's no, in principle, reason why we shouldn't.
Yeah, you mentioned the UN, and comparing your organization, like I would expect, there technically shouldn't even be a need for an IPAC if the UN was doing its job properly.
I totally agree with you. Yeah, and I think that partly out of frustration with the established international organizations that we've had to do this in the first place. Now, this is a very serious thing, because the UN is supposed to be the custodian of so many of those essential international treaties. Classic example, the Genocide Convention. The Genocide Convention binds individual states, but for a long time, individual states have entrusted the institutions of the United Nations to ensure that they could uphold their obligations under the Genocide Convention. Where are we with that now? China veto, that's where we are with that. China's dominance of the UN Human Rights Council. Now, what this means is that those institutions are not functional. They will not work. And this is just one reason among many that I think people are saying, wow, the custodians, the very institutions that we set up to safeguard and to implement these essential treaties are unable to do so because of the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party, in which case we will find other ways. If the UN will not defend common values, will not defend the rules-based system, somebody else will, and somebody else has to. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's partly because of the failings of the United Nations that we had to do this in the first place.
You've seen, for example, recently Canada finally, I believe it's the first country officially to label what's happening to the Uyghurs by China as a genocide. And I've seen a few Canadian legislators there. Do you see this trend following in the UK, the United States, and Australia? Because those countries make up a bulk of IPAC.
So, the answer to this is complex. First of all, it is important to clarify that what Canada has done is important, but it is a parliamentary committee. So we need to be a bit careful. The Canadian government has not said that it believes that a genocide is underway. That would be an entirely different thing, and we'd be having a different discussion. It's a parliamentary committee. Bear in mind that when Daesh was persecuting Yazidis and other minorities in 2014, 15, 16, in 2016, the United States government said that it believed that a genocide was underway. We got a unanimous vote in the UK Parliament saying that we thought that that was the case. The EU Parliament had a unanimous vote saying that it thought that it was the case. Happened in Canada, happened all over. Nothing really came of it because we weren't binding governments to their obligations under the Genocide Convention, and the Canadian decision does not do that, and that's a very important clarification. However, is the world moving to a place where they want there to be a proper judicial determination of what is happening in Western China? Yes. Now, this is really key. Look, I don't want to seem too conservative about these things because there are different conceptions of what genocide is. There's a political conception, there's a legal conception. The political conception and the legal conception are interdependent. Like, you don't get to the legal determination of genocide without political pressure. So you need politicians to believe it's happening in order to get to that. So what's happening in Canada is very helpful because it pushes us closer to the judicial determination. But we mustn't ever forget, genocide is a crime with a very clear burden and standard of proof, very clear law. If we are not able to prove that the Chinese Communist Party intends to destroy in whole or in part the Uyghur people by doing certain things, if we're not able to prove that intent, we will not have proven genocide. So we've got to be careful with this. You and I, many people may believe from what we have seen that the actions of the Chinese Communist Party are genocidal. That is my belief. We cannot say yet that they are genocidal until there is a judicial determination, because it's a legal term. Now, this is the problem that we've got, and this is the reason there's a catch-22, because governments for a long time have just said, well, it might be genocide, leave it up to the UN to decide through the International Criminal Court or whatever. 10, 15 years later, if you're lucky, you might get a result. Well, we haven't got 10, 15 years to wait. You know, in 10 to 15 years, how many people are going to be dead? In 10, 15 years, how many generations of people will be affected irrecoverably? Well, a lot. And for that reason, we're not prepared to accept this anymore. We're not prepared to accept that the institutions of the UN just don't function when it comes to dealing with the crime, what is supposed to be the crime above all crimes. So we're finding other ways around that, making sure that there's political pressure, but more than that, actually finding ways to determine, legally determine genocide outside of the structures of the UN, because it's simply necessary now.
Thank you for that explanation. I guess from my ignorance and many other people, I understood that the Canadian government had called it a genocide. Could you just tell us the difference, I guess, between, you know, from my ignorance, the difference between a parliamentary committee and the government, and yeah, just that, and what would hypothetically happen if governments, say, especially governments within the Big Five, within the UN, start labeling this a genocide?
So those are two great questions. First of all, like, a parliament is a group of elected officials, and the government is normally drawn from that group of elected officials from the ruling party. So the government is the people who are making the decisions about the policy of the country. Parliamentarians are just the people who are representing you, and they can be all parties. So a parliamentary committee is normally drawn from all parties. And yes, it has weight. Yes, it's important. Yes, it will increase the pressure upon the Canadian government. But what a parliamentary committee says is not government policy unless the government decides to change its view. So there's a very important distinction there. Parliaments, not governments, they're different things. So if we over here, right now, we've got two parliamentary committees underway looking into the Uyghur issue, and particularly looking into the profiting of businesses from Uyghur slave labor. Now, those committees may come to some conclusions. They're parliamentary committees. That does not add up to government policy. The parliament is there principally to hold the government to account on behalf of the people who elected them. So that's that distinction. Now, your second point, can you just remind me of what it was?
Yeah, so we had, say, like, hypothetically, if the government were to label the it a genocide, and you had major countries like the US and the UK, Australia label it a genocide, what would hypothetically happen after that? Because China is itself within the Big Five. They're on the Human Rights Council. What would happen?
They own the Human Rights Council.
Yeah.
You know, I go much further. Like, the UN Human Rights Council, unfortunately, is we have a phrase, a busted flush, and it just doesn't work. How can it possibly work when, you know, people try to create letters, nations try to create letters and statements of solidarity once international treaties like the Sino-British Joint Declaration are violated, right? Which is supposed to be a UN-lodged treaty. So when a UN institution like the UN Human Rights Council can be used to defend China's national security law in Hong Kong, you know that the thing doesn't work, right? It's a busted flush. Okay, so the question about what governments will do if they change their policy on whether or not it's genocide is a very good one. It's quite complicated. I'm going to try to make it simple. Basically, we don't know. And the reason we don't know is that it's never been done. So countries have never succeeded in adequately recognizing genocide while one was ongoing and then engaging with their obligations under the Genocide Convention. Let me make this clear.
Never been done in UN's history.
Never been done. And the reason it's never been done, but look, okay, let me qualify that slightly. Arguably, what happened with Daesh in 2016, when the US said they believed it to be a genocide, arguably it was still ongoing at that point. But the point I'm trying to make is there is not like a load of set examples of what you then do, because the Genocide Convention is a very serious document. It obliges nations to prevent, to suppress, and to punish genocide. The only thing that we've done is the punishment, and that happens very rarely. We have never done the prevention, and we have never done the suppression. Now that's really important, because it means that actually all these countries who signed this thing have just decided that they won't do the most important bit, which is to prevent and to suppress. So where are we right now with the suspected genocide of the Uyghur people in Western China? We are in a place where we need to be preventing. In fact, arguably, the opportunity to prevent has passed. We're in the stage where we need to be suppressing. Are we suppressing? No. Why? Because there hasn't been broad acceptance that the legal threshold of genocide has been met, that people can use the legal term. This is a completely hopeless situation to be in. It's a total catch-22. The system that we've set up prevents us from suppressing genocide. It's mad. So it's never been done. Countries have never, ever engaged with their obligations under the Genocide Convention to prevent or to suppress. Never. Now, that is a problem that we cannot accept and must solve. It was not what people intended when they signed that document. When they signed that document, they were saying, after the Holocaust, never again. This cannot happen again. If we see this happening again, we are under obligations. We accept those obligations to prevent it and to suppress it. Well, they're not doing that. They've never done it. And the reason they haven't done it is that it would be really expensive. It could result in boots on the ground. You know, all kinds of things which are not politically saleable. Governments would rather not deal with that. So here's the way I'd summarize it. It has been very convenient for governments for a long time to point the finger at the UN and to say, you guys are the one who deal with that genocide thing. Yeah, the most that we've ever got out of that will be convictions for genocide a long time after the genocide is finished and people are dead. That's the situation that we've got ourselves into, and it is completely unacceptable. Happily, I think we're now moving into a different space where people are like, guys, you know, this Genocide Convention, if it means anything at all, it does not mean that nations can block the possibility of being accused of genocide when they're conducting one, which is exactly what China is doing now. So they are really exposing the flaw in the system that we've built. Can't accept it. We've got to find other ways. And it's one of the reasons that we've laid amendments in the UK Parliament to try to create separate systems within the UK High Court to determine genocide. Because if it will work at the UN, well, then we're going to do it, because we need to uphold our obligations to the Genocide Convention. It's also why Sir Geoffrey Nice and a few others have started the Uyghur Tribunal, because we have to come to that judicial conclusion, that we have to get that reasoned legal definition of genocide if we're going to be able to push governments further. So I hope that gives some context.
That was very good and very comprehensive. Thank you so much. I guess a big part that plays, you know, we talk about people power, and the people technically should push their governments and parliaments to do, you know, to call it a genocide or to, you know, to boycott China diplomatically. Skepticism does play a big role, doesn't it? I mean, you know, I've seen you in protest for Hong Kong, and now you're advising World Uyghur Congress. When, you know, to label such things as genocide, you technically have to go into the region and find evidence. We can't at the moment. China doesn't let anyone do independent investigation. How do you deal with skeptics and skepticism? What sort of answers do you give them, or explanations do you give them?
So there are a few things about this. What you're saying is true in the sense that an investigation would be very beneficial and would help. But we now have mountains of evidence, mountains of the stuff. And this isn't like made up. You know, we've got loads of testimonies. Yes, you've got a lot of qualitative evidence, but there's a lot of quantitative evidence which comes direct from Chinese government data, you know, which is very, very difficult to explain away unless there are mass atrocity. crimes underway. So the skepticism, I think, was there more strongly about a year ago. Increasingly, the skeptics are finding themselves in a corner because the evidence keeps coming up. In addition to that, and this is the crucial thing, if you're going to prove genocide, it's not enough. It isn't enough to prove that really terrible things have happened, like lots of people have been killed, for example, or lots of people have been forcibly sterilized. You have to prove that it's being done with the intent to destroy that group in whole or in part. That's the difficult bit, proving the mental aspect of the crime, if you like. What evidence have we got of that? Quite a lot, because there have been leaked documents from the Chinese Communist Party, including from the mouth of Xi Jinping himself, saying that Uyghurs should be treated, quote unquote, with no mercy, and policy documents saying that the sterilization programs should be targeted at this ethnic group. Now, that starts to build a very, very powerful case. I'm not saying that it means that the threshold of genocide is reached. I don't know. I'm not a judge. I'm not, that's down to them. But what I would say is that on the face of it, to me, there is a lot of evidence. I'm quite involved with some of the aspects of the Uyghur tribunal. So the tribunal is completely separate and independent, but I've been helping with some of the organization of it. Those guys, since we opened it up, have been completely overwhelmed with evidence, like to a degree that they need to raise more money in order to try to go through that evidence. There is a vast amount. So I don't think we're wanting for evidence. An investigation would help. Of course it would. We don't think we're going to get one. Even without an investigation, I think it is possible. And as to the skeptics, there are far fewer of them now than there were a year ago, which can only be a good thing.
In the video that I played at the beginning, you said for consumers and you called for citizens to vote on their feet. What does that mean? That
means if you think that a company that you're buying things from, profiting from forced Uyghur labor, don't buy from them. Vote with your feet. You don't go in the shop. You don't buy their stuff. You say, no, we don't want your stuff. And by the way, your explanations around forced Uyghur labor are pathetic. These large companies who have been sourcing from that region for a long period of time, particularly in the apparel industry around clothing, those guys have not given an adequate explanation of what they're doing. They have not given an adequate explanation of how they are trying to stop forced Uyghur labor in the region. It's completely unacceptable. And all I would say to you is look at those companies, and if you're wearing any of those clothes, take them off, set them on fire, and tell them that you're never going to buy their clothes again.
Right. With boycotts, I'm not sure if you've been following what's been happening with Turkey and France and the Muslim world wanting to boycott French goods. And the Uyghurs have been arguing, well, if Islamophobia is the criteria for boycotting French, hello, the biggest Islamophobes in the world, China. Do you have any comments on this?
I think, look, it isn't for me to try to understand what is going on in the psychology of the very, very complex and extremely broad world of Islam. All I would say is that I cannot understand the double standard applied to China other than through the lens of economics and One Belt, One Road investment and diplomatic leverage. It makes no sense. I cannot understand why the Islamic confreres of people in Islamic countries or in the Middle East are not defended by the leaders of those countries or by those populations. Makes no sense to me. And it's one of the things that I find very difficult. That whenever criticisms are made of China at the United Nations, you can bet your bottom dollar that China will bring forward a counter proposal that will be signed by most of those Islamic nations. That's a terrible sadness. And it's something that I think that we all need to try to speak out against, but particularly I think Islamic voices need to speak out against, because, the way that the narrative is around Islam in the West isn't terribly helpful. And I don't think it's terribly helpful for those countries to have people like me point the finger. But I do believe it's a double standard, and I wish there'd be more people within the community who would say that.
Great. Sort of coming towards the end of our interview, I want to talk about one more issue, and that is the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics, and how the IOC is saying that, you know what, politics is one thing, you know, athletes should not be punished. What do you see with this, the Olympic Games coming up in a few years' time, a couple of years' time?
So there are two things. The first thing is that I don't want to see the athletes punished. Those guys have worked for 4 years, very, very hard, and most of them for almost no pay. They produce a spectacular sporting event that everybody around the world likes to watch. We don't want them to be punished. Rather than a straight-up boycott, what I think is the better policy suggestion is for a change of venue. It basically means a boycott, but it means that we're trying to safeguard this sporting event on behalf of those athletes and on behalf of the people who enjoy it. Don't tell me that there aren't countries who can't do that. Canada can. Sweden can. Norway could. Tomorrow, they have the infrastructure. These guys need to come forward and say, we'll do it. You know, we don't want this event to be, in China, legitimizing this brutal regime. We don't want it anywhere near there. We're going to do it in our own countries. And if they did, I think that would really create a headache for the IOC. Just one point about Mr. Bach's terrible Guardian article, which was the worst piece of appeasement that I think we've seen from the IOC, possibly since 1936, when Berlin hosted the Games, and it did exactly what we think it would do this time round, which is legitimize a genocidal regime. What did it do? It gave them an opportunity to launder their reputation to the world, to make a show of strength to the world, to make a propaganda argument about themselves to the world. Do we really want to be doing that with 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps? No. And I think that we've got to be really clear about it. So the argument he's trying to make there, that this should be above politics, works to a certain degree. It works in the sense that we need to be able to bring people together. The Olympics has always been a time of truce and a time of unification, of international unity, and that is a great thing. There are limits on that. There have to be limits on that. And if there are not, then it undermines the very unity that you're trying to safeguard. You cannot have unity while there's a genocidal state amongst you. I'm sorry, but that's where you're past the line. So, to my mind, what Mr. Bach was saying was completely false, demonstrably false. I don't think it will stand. I think although they will resist any effort to boycott Beijing or to move the location, this is only going to grow. The political pressure around this is only going to grow. The campaign is only going to get stronger. And after writing that article, you know, Mr. Bach is going to get a big headache, and he deserves one, because I read that piece as really quite shocking appeasement. Put it this way, I think if his kids had been taken away from him, put in a re-education camp, or if his wife had been forcibly sterilized or had her womb torn out, he'd probably come to a different conclusion.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Is there anything that's coming up on your part, whether it be through Arise Foundation or the World Uyghur Congress or IPAC, any sort of events or campaigns that you'll be launching in the next few weeks or months?
There are going to be lots. Unfortunately, I can't tell you about many of them. So you're going to have to wait and see. Yeah, there are a lot of them around all of these issues, particularly around just the truly egregious human rights abuses that are happening at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, which cannot be allowed to stand. And if they are allowed to stand, I'm afraid that this whole international system is without foundation. And I think people are agreeing that more and more now. So we're moving to a better space, but we need all the help we can get. And anybody listening to this really needs to put their shoulder behind what we're doing, to circulate IPAC stuff, particularly on China, to encourage your legislators. If you've got legislators in IPAC, if you're living in a country with legislators in IPAC, encourage them, thank them, circulate their stuff, because they need all the encouragement they can get. Let me tell you, they're out on a limb.
And with that, thank you so much, Luke. You know, everybody, I've tagged this with the necessary tags. Follow the work that Luke does. IPAC, as you mentioned, share their things. Talk to the legislators if they are within that comprehensive group of co-chairs and members. I want to thank Luke. I want to thank everyone that's watched today. And until next time, don't hop off, Luke. I just want to talk to you after the broadcast for a minute or so. Until next time, guys. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.